Okay, so here's a weird question for you. Why is it false to say the moon is made of cheese? I mean, it sounds obvious, right? But what is it? What thing in the real world that actually makes it false? Well, that's the kind of deep, kind of mind-bending question that philosopher Michelle Paolletti gets into with his work on something he calls falsemakers. And today on Phil Report, we're going to break down his whole investigation into, the reality of nothing.
So let's start with a super simple, totally false statement. The moon is made of cheese. We all know it isn't true. No debate there.
But here's where it gets tricky, and this is the core philosophical puzzle. What is the thing, out there in reality, that makes that statement false? Is it the fact that the moon is made of rock? Or the fact that it lacks cows? Or maybe the vacuum of space? What exactly is the source of its falsehood? That is the big question at the heart of this fascinating paper by Michelle Paolletti.
So, how does Paolletti even begin to tackle this? Well, he starts by setting up the core of the problem, and it actually begins with a much simpler idea, one about truth.
It's something called the Truthmaker Principle. And honestly, it's pretty intuitive. For any true statement out there, there has to be something in the world that makes it true. So the statement, "there's a cat on the mat," is true because, well, there's actually a physical cat sitting on a physical mat. That whole situation is the truthmaker. Simple enough, right?
Now here's where things get really interesting. We take that same logic and apply it to false statements. So if truths need a truthmaker, then it just kind of stands to reason that falsehoods must need a falsemaker. There's got to be something, some fact or state of affairs in the world that makes the statement, "John is a waiter," false. The big question is, what in the world could that falsemaker possibly be?
Paolletti's whole method here is basically a philosophical detective investigation. It's really cool. He lines up 5 main suspects for what this mysterious falsemaker could be, and then he puts each one to the test to see if it holds up.
So let's take a look at our lineup of suspects. We've got negative doppelgangers, negative facts, a mysterious not particle, something called negative instantiation, and finally, negative properties. We're going to go through these one by one and see which one, if any, survives the interrogation. All right, suspect number 1 is definitely the most sci-fi sounding of the bunch, negative doppelgangers. The theory here suggests that for every single object, like you, there's a non-you out there in the world that has all the properties you don't have. So, if you're not a waiter, this theory says your doppelganger is a waiter.
Yeah, the problem with this one, it falls apart really, really fast. Think about it. Let's say you don't live in Philadelphia, and you also don't live in New York. Well, your doppelganger would have to live in both places at the exact same time. That's just a bizarre, totally contradictory object that there's absolutely no reason to think exists. So yeah, suspect number 1 is eliminated.
Okay, on to a more plausible sounding idea. Suspect number 2, negative facts. The idea is that the statement, "John is not a waiter," is made false by a negative fact. In this case, the simple fact that John is not a waiter. This theory just says that the negativity is a basic, fundamental quality of that fact. It just is. No further explanation needed.
But this doesn't really solve the problem, does it? It just kind of kicks the can down the road. Because if you ask, okay, but what makes that fact negative? The only answer is another negative fact about the first fact, and then another one about that one, and so on forever. That's what philosophers call a vicious infinite regress, because it never actually explains anything. So suspect number 2 is eliminated.
Let's move on to suspect number 3, the not particle. This idea basically treats negation like it's a physical ingredient. The falsemaker for "John is a waiter" is a fact made up of 3 parts: John, the property of being a waiter, and some mysterious third thing, a negative particle, the pure essence of notness.
So besides this being a completely mysterious entity that has no other job in the universe, it makes the really simple idea of an object having a property way more complicated than it needs to be. Sometimes it's a 2-way street, sometimes it's a 3-way street. It's not a clean solution. Eliminated. So what about our 4th suspect? This one's called negative instantiation. Here, the idea isn't that the object is negative or that the property is negative, but that the link between them is. John is connected to the property of being a waiter by a negative tie, a kind of relationship of not having. Now, this is a pretty clever move, but as Paolletti argues, it doesn't really get us out of the woods. A negative relationship is really just a negative property that a couple of things share. So this solution, it ultimately just collapses into our very last suspect. It's not a real alternative. Eliminated. So after all that, after testing and eliminating all the other possibilities, what did Paolletti find? Well, we are left with just one suspect standing. And it's a conclusion that seems a little strange at first, but it's the one Paolletti argues is the most logical. Negative properties are real.
So here's the solution we're left with. The thing that makes John as a waiter false is a real, actual property that John has. And that property is the property of non-being a waiter. The world, according to this view, doesn't just contain positive properties like being read, but it also contains negative ones, like non-being read. Now you're probably thinking of some objections right away. First, we can't see non-readness. But hold on, we perceive absences all the time. A hole in a shirt is literally defined by a lack of fabric. Second, they have no causal power. But what about inertia? That's the property of non-accelerating. Or a plant dying from a lack of water. And third, doesn't this mean there are infinite properties? The argument here is that we only need to accept the negative properties that we actually need to be falsemakers, not every single one we can imagine.
And this quote from philosopher David Hummon really hits the nail on the head. He says we shouldn't think of negative as some weird kind of existence. It's a logical term, not some spooky feature of reality. In other words, negative is just a label we use to sort things out in our minds. It doesn't mean the property itself is somehow ghostly or less real than a so-called positive one.
Okay, look, this is a really fascinating philosophical puzzle for sure, but why should you care? Does the existence of the property of non-being a waiter actually matter in the real world? Well, the answer is, surprisingly, yes.
You know, when you start taking negative properties seriously, it actually helps make sense of a lot of important stuff. In science, for example, it gives us a real-world hook for concepts like being at rest, which is just non-moving, or chemical inertness, which is all about non-reacting. It helps explain how our language even works when we're just talking about things that aren't true, and it's absolutely crucial for understanding causation by omission. You know, like when the absence of water causes a plant to die. This stuff even has potential implications for AI, which needs a really solid way to reason about what's not true.
Now, this theory isn't without its own challenges. A really big limitation is just how hard it is to come up with a perfect way to tell if a property is truly positive or negative without just relying on the words we use. I mean, is being at rest a negative property, non-moving, or is it a positive one on its own? And that leads to a really big open question. Are these negative properties a fundamental part of reality itself? Are they just a feature of how we humans have to describe it? The debate on that is far from over.
And that's our breakdown of the great philosophical hunt for the falsemaker. If you found this Phil report useful for getting your head around some complex research, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and definitely let me know your thoughts down in the comments.
And for our final thought, what paper or complex topic do you want to see broken down next? Tell me in the comments, and I just might cover it in a future explainer. Thanks for watching.